put in my thingy there.
44? Okay.
Oh, you gotta take some.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
You can like it.
Oh, you grabbed your lunch, Renee?
Yes. Do you want me to grab you one?
Yeah, I'm gonna grab one. That's a good idea.
They're wired for sound. Especially things at the end in case it's very good. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle McDonald, and I am the director of the Library and Museum at the American Philosophical Society. Before we begin this afternoon's presentation, the American Philosophical Society acknowledges, with respect, that it resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. We recognize their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. Throughout its history, the Society has benefited from its residence in this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. We honor the Lenape community and those of other Native peoples through our collections, our fellowships, our research awards, and our engagement activities. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, and is there anyone joining us for the first time? Okay, so for you, right. The American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. Most of our nation's founders, as many of you know, were members, including Thomas Jefferson for 17 years. During most of his time, he was either vice president or president of the United States. Today, we sustain that founding mission in three principal ways. We honor and engage leading scholars and scientists and professionals through elected membership and opportunities for intellectual fellowship. We serve scholars through a research program and our manuscripts and other collections, which are internationally recognized for their historic value. And we support research and discovery through grants, fellowships, lectures, publications, exhibitions, and public education, like today's activity. The current museum exhibition, Sketching Splendor, works to reveal the unacknowledged labor of people of color, of indigenous peoples, and women, many of them unknown to us by name, who assisted ambitious white men in their quest for scientific knowledge and enduring fame. Copies of that exhibition, and if you haven't seen the exhibition, I very much encourage you to do so. It will be on display through the end of December, but copies of the exhibition catalog are available in the back of the room after today's talk. But in the meantime, the conversation we are about to have explores the making of Audubon's Birds of America, a central artifact in Sketching Splendor, and the efforts of the APS Conservation Department to prepare the double elephant folio for display. Now, I'm not going to give a lot away because Anne and Renee's work to make these volumes ready was a truly impressive task and is the focus of their presentation. So it is with great pleasure, and don't get ready yet because these are long introductions. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our speakers today, Renée Wolcott and Anne Downey. Renée is the Assistant Head of Conservation and Book Conservator. She graduated from the Winterthur University of Delaware Master's Program in Art Conservation in 2011, and before joining the APS, she worked as a book conservator at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. Very soon, Renée will have a new title as our Head of Conservation, because we will be saying farewell to Anne. This is now her final week before retirement from the APS. Anne, oh yeah, go ahead. Anne is our current head of conservation at the APS, and her most important role in this capacity is to ensure the overall care and safety of the library and museum collections, work that she has done for 21 years. She received her MA and Certificate of Advanced Studies in Art Conservation from the State University of New York College at Buffalo and is a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation. Before joining the APS, Anne worked at various capacities for the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, for Wick Historic House, Garden and Farm, and for the Library of Congress. Her lifelong love of all things paper has helped shape her convictions about the importance of investing in our material cultural heritage. This is Anne's second to last day at the APS, but before she goes, see, I'd built in the applause bit. Before she goes, I think we should celebrate her contributions to the Society for 2 decades plus. a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Michelle. That was very kind, and thank you all. We're so happy that you're all here. Great to see you. What we're about to embark on is a 2-year journey.
I stupidly took this off. Hold on. There we go.
Okay. An exploration of our 2-year journey. And you get to see what happened behind the scenes as we did our conservation treatment on the birds of America.
Yes, and to keep us from talking for an hour and a half, we're mostly going to be reading to you, which I apologize for, but you'll see why.
It's a lot of
moment.
material.
Yeah.
Pay attention.
Yep. Okay. So we want to start by stressing the literal enormity of this project. Conserving and exhibiting these volumes is a tall task because each volume weighs about 50 pounds. There are 435 plates altogether, not all of which have been treated yet. Ours have been trimmed down slightly, but each is about the size of a movie poster. The open books have the same wingspan also as a red-tailed hawk. Here you see conservation intern Brittany Murray and associate director for the museum, Mary Grace Wall, checking the first volume, which is in Sketching Splendor, as was already mentioned. And if you haven't had the chance to see it, definitely do go. It's beautiful, and you can gauge the size of these prints for yourself. So our story begins not with Audubon necessarily, but with some of the other ambitious men who shaped the APS and its natural history collections in the early 19th century. At the time, members of learned societies in Europe were eager for information about the animals, plants, and birds that were found on this continent. Naturalists competed with one another to find and name new species. Alexander Wilson, who immigrated from Scotland to Philadelphia in 1794, became the first expert on North American birds. On his hunting and sketching trips, he was sometimes accompanied by his good friend and fellow scientist, George Ord, the gentleman here in the center. In 1808, Wilson began publishing American Ornithology, a 9-volume work containing illustrations and essays on 268 American birds, including 26 previously unknown species. When Wilson died penniless in 1813, George Ord served as his executor. Ord went on to oversee publication of the last 2 volumes of Wilson's work and to serve as APS's secretary, vice president, counselor, treasurer, and librarian. So he was a very important figure here.
And then we have John James Audubon, on the other hand. He was the illegitimate son of a French plantation owner in Haiti. He fled France for Pennsylvania in 1803 to avoid conscription in Napoleon's army and later settled his young family in Kentucky. While he had been drawing and exploring nature his entire life, he now took this opportunity to start to develop a new persona, that of American artist and ornithologist. Part of what drove him to excel at his art may have been that he was so abysmally untalented in business. His typical pattern involved uprooting his family yet again to pursue yet another promising business opportunity, but then he'd go off on the sly and spend hours, days, months tramping through the backwoods, hunting and drawing the birds that he shot. His hobby of drawing birds really became his obsession. Audubon became determined to produce drawings that evoked the life he so enjoyed in nature, while earlier naturalists modeled their rather stilted work on taxidermied birds. Audubon took freshly killed birds and used wires to manipulate them into lifelike poses. To reproduce them at life size, which was another novel approach, he set the composed birds against a grid, which allowed him to make a one-to-one transfer in pencil on his drawing paper. His mature style relied on an array of media, which included pastel, watercolor, oil paint, and sometimes collage and others, manipulated all of this media to produce the level of texture, sheen, and modeling that he wanted. So his original artworks essentially blur the line between drawing and painting.
With Birds of America, Audubon's goal was to surpass Alexander Wilson and his work on a massive scale, illustrating 435 birds rather than 268 and printing them all at life size. And here you can see that size does matter. This is approximately the ratio between those two books. He broke with the established conventions for illustration by not only depicting the birds, but depicting them in their natural environments, although often these backgrounds to the prints were painted not by himself, but by his uncredited assistant, James Mason, among others, I believe. He routinely relied on the knowledge of Black and Indigenous guides, whose names have been lost to us. Many historians believe Audubon also engaged in scientific fraud, making up imaginary new species and reporting false data to help make a name for himself. Today, his reputation has also been tarnished by his status as a slaveholder who opposed abolition. In his own day, he banked on his image as a rustic outsider. This did not fly for him so well in Philadelphia, which was a city with established scientific credentials. In 1824, when Audubon returned from Kentucky to seek a publisher and subscribers for Birds of America, he already had a serious enemy in George Ord, who continued to champion his friend Alexander Wilson. Not only did Audubon threaten Wilson's legacy, to the well-connected Ord, he was a backwoods upstart of dubious origins and questionable scientific practices. As vice president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, Ord opposed Audubon's candidacy for membership, and Audubon was neither elected nor received official backing for his project. Having failed in Philadelphia, he went to England to seek support for his publication.
Now, in England, he played up his American woodsman persona, giving sketches like this one to supporters. At first, he exhibited his drawings in his cramped apartments and solicited the favor of influencers there. Doors began opening for him once he showed his work to Lord Stanley, who was a respected naturalist. Within a year of his arrival in Great Britain, Audubon became well known for his bird drawings and was thought authentic and a simple intellect by British society. With these new connections, he finally landed a publishing contract with William Home Lizars, a highly regarded engraver in Edinburgh. The engravings were to be printed life-size, as Audubon had drawn them, which required an oversized paper known as double elephant. The prints would be issued in 87 sets, each consisting of 5 engravings, 1 large bird, 1 medium bird, and 3 small birds. Subscribers would pay in advance and then receive a set, or number, as these sets were called. And once they had been printed and colored, they would get them. Audubon paid for the first number of 5 plates, which are shown here, along with a prospectus he could show to potential subscribers. He hoped to impress them right out of the gate with the grandeur of the first plate, showing a large bird printed life-size for the first time in history, the wild turkey male. Each number was to be priced at 2 guineas, which is equivalent to roughly $300 today. In its entirety, the Birds of America plates cost just over $26,000 in today's money.
So how were Audubon's drawings turned into prints? Engraving, etching, and aquatint are all intaglio print processes, from Italian for to cut. In intaglio printing, the image to be reproduced is cut, scratched, or eaten with acid into a copper printing plate, reversing the image so it will be printed the right way round. So not only are you copying the image, but you're actually developing a mirror image of it at the same time. For an engraving, a pointed tool called a burin is used to gouge out sharp lines that create the image. When the engraved plate is finished, an oil-based ink, similar to an oil paint, is pushed deep into the lines, and then the surface is wiped clean again. The inked plate is put through a rolling press with a sheet of dampened paper on top, and the extreme pressure transfers the ink out of those incised lines and onto the paper. And under magnification, an intaglio print will always show the ink heaped up on the surface of the paper, as you can see here in this close-up image. In an etching, the incised lines are created with acid rather than with a burin. First, the whole copper plate is coated with an acid-resistant resin, and the drawing is scratched through the coating with an etching needle, which you can see on the left there. The plate is then dipped into an acid bath, which eats into the plate wherever the coating has been removed. After the plate has been cleaned, engraved details can be added if desired, and then it's inked and printed the same way as an engraving. And Lazars used both of these techniques for the first few Audubon prints.
The last production step, after the plates were etched, then engraved, and finally printed in black ink, was hand coloring. Engravers relied on armies of colorists, mostly women, as in this image of a printing shop, to hand paint their prints with watercolors. The colorists, each armed with a brush and one color, would color in the prints following Audubon's pattern proof, in which he gave explicit directions regarding color and depth of tone. At first, this might be thought of as being similar to a modern-day coloring book like here, but colorists, however, were skilled artisans, yet always anonymous and poorly paid. Lazar's shop was no exception. 7 prints into production, his team of colorists went on strike, and Audubon's work was halted. Fortunately for Audubon, he was able to find another printer, London's Havell & Son, to take up production. As an added bonus, Robert Havell Jr. was a master of a relatively new technique called aquatint, which was used to add subtle gradations of shading to the intaglio prints. This was a technique that Lazar shied away from due to the difficulty of preparing the plate. And fast forwarding to Jasper Johns for a minute, like etching, aquatint relies on an acid-resistant coating, although this time it is applied by sprinkling the plate with grains of acid-resistant resin. The plate is then heated to melt the resin. The irregular granular coating allows the acid bath to create a soft, mottled base tint, like the image on the right. Second state. Robert Havell's mastery enabled him to create several shades by using just aquatint. This gives the effect of gradation of tones, allowing the colorist to use just one color in a design element. In the image on the right, for example, the large leaf has 3 shades of gray created just by using aquatint, and then 1 wash of applied green watercolor. Using aquatint, along with etching and engraving, achieved the naturalistic effects Audubon wanted.
So as Birds of America took flight in England between 1827 and 1838, in Philadelphia, George Ord's animosity toward the project continued unabated, as you will see if you read this excerpt from one of his letters. As the Society's most diligent book purchasing agent, Ord also had some control over the books that were added to the APS collections during this period. So how did the Society acquire a copy of Birds of America during his tenure? In essence, the librarian and members quietly revolted while Ord was on a book-buying trip to Paris. On July 15, 1831, John James Audubon was finally elected as a member of the Society, and on October 7, 1831, Audubon and 24 more APS members, including its president and its librarian, donated Birds of America and its companion volume of essays, an ornithological biography, to the APS Library. By the time Ord returned to Philadelphia in December, the vile plates and stupid book had become part of the collection he was managing so carefully. Ironically, if you look at these giant volumes, Ord's name is the one on the book plate, as if he is the one who contributed them to the library, which is completely not the case. And nobody has been able to tell any of us why that's true. So if you happen to know, we would be curious. The Society's next challenge was having the massive plates bound into volumes. And so these are like movie posters, as you said, individual sheets of paper, not with a fold that you can sew through. So in 1837, with the conclusion of the series, APS librarian John Vaughan reached out for advice from Audubon collaborator John Bachman of South Carolina, who had already tackled this problem. Bachman wrote back and described the difficulty with finding cover boards and end leaf paper large enough to accommodate the size of the print. He wrongly probably assumed that this would not be any problem in Philadelphia. Thanks to the APS treasurer's accounts, we know that our plates were not actually bound until 1840, when Audubon himself paid $40 to have bookbinder C. Carl bind the plates into 4 volumes. That's the equivalent of roughly $1,500 today. Maybe part of the reason why Audubon also died penniless. What did this investment get the APS? It's not entirely clear, since the plates were rebound in the late 19th century, but receipts from C. Carl to John Vaughan suggest that he bound the volumes in Russia leather and that they were gilt, which means they had gold-tooled decoration. So they're fancy, in other words. This is a late 18th century example of a gilt Russia leather binding on a far smaller book. True Russia leather was thick, reddish-brown, and extremely durable, which made it really good for binding oversized volumes like these. It was also impregnated with birch bark extract to help make it more water-resistant, and this gave it a distinctive smell. By the early 19th century, though, imitators were producing leather that looked and smelled similar but deteriorated rapidly. If Carl used such leather, it may explain why the plates needed rebinding only 57 years later. His binding methods and sewing methods may also have been to blame. The spine edges of most of the plates show 9 saw cuts flanked by 2 pierced holes in the gutter edge, and then the outermost plates are often are pierced every ½ inch or so. So this suggests that he was stab stitching or whip stitching the groups of poster-sized plates together, which created artificial folds that he could then sew through to get them into a bound volume. Unfortunately, this lets glue in sometimes, and it also is a little undesirable for plates like this because the paper grain goes opposite to the way that the pages need to flex. Even though this is a fast, cheap way to sew a book, it would have prevented the cross-grained plates from opening very well. And if you did try to make them lie flat, it would either tear the paper or break the sewing thread. And there's ample evidence that this happened when the C. Carl bindings were on the books. In 1897, Pawson and Nicholson, a respected team of Philadelphia bookbinders, committed to repairing and rebinding the plates. This time, the birds were bound into 5 volumes, not 4. They mounted many of the plates onto linen, trimmed them to minimize edge damage from the prior handling, mended their remaining edge tears, and hinged them to thick paper stubs with linen tape to improve the book openings. The bindings themselves have very thick, heavy boards, spines and corners of red leather, and sides of maroon bookcloth. The photo on the right shows how the stubs allow the plates to hinge about 2 inches from the rigid spine, so dealing with the cross-grained paper in a more compassionate way. When we first started examining the bindings for exhibition 2 years ago, at first we were primarily concerned with the cradle design. In spite of the stubbed construction, the books still don't lie flat. The hinges of the stubs tend to nest together and stick in that way. And many of the end leaves were cracked near the gutter from opening the books too far and closing them too rapidly afterwards. We also found that 100 of the 435 plates had been lined with linen, 127 had been mended with squares of tracing cloth, some of which had split again, like this image in the middle, and 49 more had new tears that required attention. After seeing several instances where the text had been cut off, like on the right here, we discovered that the plates had been trimmed approximately 1 inch in height and width during their restoration and rebinding. We also saw lots of glue stains and inky or grimy fingerprints, which probably dated both from the rebinding and from the original printing.
Soon, however, we began to notice a more subtle problem. While examining the second Audubon volume with curator Anna Majeski, we stumbled upon plate 141, which features 2 goshawks and a Stanley hawk. The whole plate seemed strangely flat and muddy with a mottled surface. One dark spot stood out by contrast on the adult goshawk's wing on the left-hand side. And the Stanley hawk on the right appeared to have a thumbprint on its right shoulder. What was going on? As we began to look more closely, we found a dull purple haze or surface coating that obscured the details of many of the plates, particularly in the darkest areas. Since the largest birds are often the darkest, if we're thinking owls and eagles, instead of warblers and finches, our most impressive plates often looked the worst. With apologies to Jimi Hendrix, we had to make sure that this purple haze was not all in our brains. So we started a condition survey of all 5 volumes. Volume 1, which had been handled and displayed the most, turned out to be the least affected, but we still found the purple haze on 37 of its plates. The other books were noticeably worse. Volume 2 had purple haze on 46 plates. The hazy material on the surface made the plates look flat and lifeless, or mottled and cloudy, like the turkey buzzard's tail feathers here. Where the hazy material had been disturbed, as in the dark spots over the top barn owl's head, the darker media underneath was distracting. The last 3 volumes, which feature many shorebirds and water scenes, were especially problematic. In this plate, the haze obscures the birds' dark plumage, the shadows in the vegetation, and the dark areas of the stone and water. Areas that were glazed with an additional layer of clear material seem to have escaped that haze. This frigate bird is disturbingly cloudy all over. Up close, it appears to have been spattered with a haze-fighting liquid. We're still not sure why. And if you're curious, the naked fairies in the sky are actually pictures of the bird's feet.
To make sure that what we were seeing was not a deliberate effect of some kind, we visited the Drexel Academy of Natural Sciences and looked at their copies of volumes 1 and 2. Their plates did not have the same hazy appearance, and the colors looked richer and darker overall. Here you can see the difference between the flat background, gray, in our barn owl plate, and the deep blue-black background in the Academy's version. This detail of the red bar in the goshawk's wing is also telling. Far more printed details are visible in the Academy's version, where you can see individual printed barbules or barbs in the feather. Our goshawk has a flat gray wing, and the haze completely obscures the feather details. The glazed red bar is the only detail that shows through the murk.
So, what was the haze? And was it caused by something that was original to the prints or something that was added later? As conservators, we knew that hand-colored engravings can deteriorate in many ways. Oil and varnish can leach out inks, causing a hazy white bloom on the surface. Watercolors can become friable and chalky. Gum-based glazes can become hazy and opaque in unstable environments. We don't like to remove original material unless it is truly inherently damaging. That's a part of our code of ethics. But our plates had linen linings. What else might have been done to them during that repair process? Could this be a more recent coating that was becoming hazy? Whatever its cause, we agreed it had to go. We started some very preliminary testing to characterize the hazy material using the basics in our toolkit. Does water move it? No. Water sits on the surface like a dumb blob until it eventually evaporates. This might suggest the presence of something oily or resinous on the surface. How about alcohol? If the problem was ink blanching due to an oily bloom, plain old ethanol or isopropanol would drive the deposits back into the ink. But when these solvents had dried, there was no change whatsoever to the haze. How about we look at it using a UV light? And on the right, this was our little attempt to make it dark enough to see any possible coatings that might fluoresce.
Who is that woman under the
Who
green
is
blanket?
that? I wonder.
Examination became a lot easier after we moved volume 2 across the street into the conservation lab. We were finally able to look at the plates under the microscope, where we discovered that the hazy material was usually, but not always, associated with the paint rather than with the ink. Here you can see the purple tint of the black paint overlying the printed aquatint texture. With the aid of magnification, we could also tell that the thing that looked like a fingerprint on the shoulder of the Stanley hawk really was a fingerprint. Even though our solvents hadn't budged the haze, the fingerprint suggested that it could be physically removed. So we tried a small piece of white vinyl eraser somewhere else on the Stanley hawk, and it worked great at lifting the hazy material. But we still needed to know what it was before we went around removing it all because of our feelings about original materials. So Anne took a microscopic sample of the material for analysis by Kirsten Moffat, my classmate, the paint conservator and materials analyst at Colonial Williamsburg. Kirsten is a master at pigment identification, which allows her to determine how the structures at Colonial Williamsburg were originally painted. When she analyzed our sample using polarized light microscopy, she found a lot of pigments: red lake, bone black, lead white, yellow ochre. Most of the pigment was bone black. We had expected her to find some evidence of a smeary purple coating, but she did not. Maybe it was only detectable at greater magnification or with a technique that is better at analyzing organic materials. Kirsten's additional analysis with scanning electron microscopy didn't add anything to our understanding. It just confirmed the presence of the pigments she had already identified under the microscope. And Fourier transform infrared spectrometry, or FTIR, which is better at organic materials, was able to confirm that the paint particles were suspended in a cellulosic watercolor binder, probably a gum arabic, which is the normal binder for watercolors. None of the analysis suggested that a foreign coating or material was present and had been added later. Our haze appeared to be nothing more than loose pigment.
We decided that maybe our sampling method had been flawed. If we had a powdery purple coating, it would be very hard to remove it without contamination from the underlying paint, even working under the microscope. But we knew it could be picked up with an eraser. Could we erase some of it and send the dirty eraser crumbs out for analysis? As it turned out, yes. Chris Peterson, an analytical chemist at Winterthur, apparently just loves the challenge. Here, the top spectrum shows all of the information included in our eraser crumb sample. When he subtracted the part of the spectrum related to the vinyl plasticizer in the eraser, all that was left were a few peaks related to skin oils, which you would expect from handling. There was no signature for gum arabic, which meant we hadn't pulled up the body of the watercolor itself, or a deteriorated glaze on the surface. If you combine this with Kirsten's results, this meant that the haze on the surface was purely loose pigment. It wasn't something added later. It was, unfortunately, original to the plates, an original material, and not something that we could remove. These results still left us scratching our heads. When we consulted our colleagues, only one other institution had experienced the same problem, and they had no idea what caused it. Gwen Manthe, paintings conservator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, was able to give us a clue once she heard about all the bone black in our pigment sample. Bone black, apparently, is known to be problematic among paintings conservators. Burning the bones to make the pigment causes dehydration and breakage of hydroxyl bonds, which makes the pigment eternally thirsty for moisture. In our case, it has sucked moisture from the watercolor and ink binders, making them dry and desiccated, and lets go of those pigment particles. This leaves a powdery coating of pigment on the surface. But you may be asking, how can a powdery black pigment look purple? The purple color of the haze on our prints turned out to be an optical phenomenon. Tiny particles scatter light, particularly in the shorter wavelengths, at the blue and violet end of the spectrum. The sky, for example, looks blue because of light scattering off of microscopic particles in the atmosphere. In our case, which you see on the left, the loose black pigment particles appear opaque and scatter short blue or purple wavelengths of light back to the viewer's eyes. So what was the solution? Resaturating the binder with moisture and sticking the pigment particles back together again should smooth out the paint film, stop the light scattering, and allow the translucency of the dark areas to reappear. In the conservation world, this process is known as consolidation. The goal of consolidation in general is to reattach flaking or powdery materials.
Consolidants are usually weak adhesive solutions, similar to the gum Arabic solution that originally would have held the watercolor pigments together. Anne and I consulted the conservation literature and found that our colleagues have used dilute solutions of many different adhesives to consolidate watercolors. Since we knew that alcohol penetrated the surface of the paint while water did not, we also knew we'd need to include a proportion of alcohol in our solution to make it penetrate the surface. We began our testing with gelatin and methyl cellulose and compared them with a spot where we had erased the haze. Now, both gelatin and methyl cellulose are transparent food-grade adhesives. Gelatin you'll be familiar with from Jell-O. That obviously has colorant added to it, but it's clear when it doesn't have anything in it. And methyl cellulose is a thickener that's used in things like McDonald's milkshakes, and it comes in a variety of viscosities. The good news was that consolidation worked. Here you can see, I hope you can see, 5 tiny spots where a mixture of dilute adhesives and alcohols eliminated the haze from a branch. Based on our first tests, ethanol helped the consolidants penetrate the best, and dilute solutions of methyl cellulose in water and ethanol required fewer coats than mixtures with gelatin. We decided to move forward with the solution we liked best, a 1-to-1 mixture of ethanol and 1% A15C methyl cellulose. This variety has a very low molecular weight, which means it is very runny rather than viscous, so it penetrates more easily. Penetration allows the watercolor binder to plump up with moisture before all the solvent evaporates.
But how should we apply this runny consolidant? It was important that we only consolidated the hazy areas and nothing else. We also wanted to be fast and efficient as well as effective, and sometimes we had large areas to treat. Spraying or misting the consolidant would be fast, and this is a standard method for achieving even penetration. Could we do that? To test this method, we tried several types of sprayer using mock-ups of black mat board with bird shapes traced on them. We also tested several methods for masking areas we didn't want to consolidate. What did we find? It took forever to create the masks. They were difficult to align properly, even on a perfectly flat drawing, and the spray was difficult to control. We had to finish off the edges of the masked area with a brush application anyway. And in the real world, we were dealing with enormous bound volumes that could not possibly lay flat. Spraying the parts we wanted to spray without spraying everything else in creation would be a nightmare, and it would require decades of time and gallons of consolidant. Well, that might be an exaggeration, but at this point, we knew what we were going to do, brush application. Still, we weren't quite ready to jump into treatment. We needed to understand whether there were any hidden dangers associated with consolidating these plates. We didn't want to change their original appearance just to restore it. And gamboge, a common yellow watercolor pigment, is soluble in ethanol. Fortunately for us, gamboge turns a dark velvety brown in ultraviolet light. When we examined the Audubon plates with our colleague, Joan Irving, then paper conservator at Winterthur, we found gamboge everywhere. If you check out the eye, from normal light to UV light, that chocolatey brown color. And it turned out that yellow wasn't the only color we had to worry about. Gamboge was also present in greens and browns like the leaves and feathers in this plate. It was everywhere. We were going to have to be very careful.
And with that figured out, we still had one remaining hurdle. Conservation ethics requires us to document everything fully, both with photography and with writing, before we start changing anything. For Birds of America, photography required some additional problem solving because they're so huge, and it took 3 days of labor. Many thanks to Will Bucher for designing and building our oversized book cradle, and to Brent Wall for doing the photography. You may recognize the space in which he had to work to get enough distance from the book to be able to photograph it properly. With documentation taken care of, we could finally dive into treatment. On October 8th of last year, I consolidated the turkey buzzard with the 1-to-1 solution of ethanol and runny methylcellulose. The dark areas of the plate had been almost white in some places, and the improvement was dramatic. But I found that it took 3 to 6 coats of the consolidant to saturate it completely, and some areas, like the top buzzard's tail, were incredibly stubborn. On October 9th, Anne tried the same solution on our old friends the goshawk and Stanley hawk, and had some of the same frustrations. Full saturation took multiple coats, and the hazy appearance reasserted itself over time. Could we not find a way to make this go faster? In early November, we carried out further testing with different percentages of consolidants and a wider range of solvents, including isopropanol and acetone. We also tried using A4M methylcellulose, which is more viscous than A15C. In this round of testing, a 1-to-1 mixture of ethanol with the more viscous version was the best performer. So I tried this new consolidant mixture on the rest of the barn owl plate, and it made a dramatic difference. But it didn't entirely eliminate the haze in the sky, where you could still see some smudges and smears after treatment. In an even more disheartening development, the haze reverted to some degree after only a week or 2. Our consolidant solution clearly needed more work, and it may be difficult to see in the barn owl plate, but it's more obvious with the turkey buzzard. After 3 weeks, it was getting hazy again.
We were increasingly determined to find a permanent, fast-working consolidant that would not revert. We needed a solvent mixture that would penetrate the paint film rapidly, carrying the consolidant with it. We also needed a solvent mixture with enough dwell time to resaturate the paint film with a minimum of coats. Dwell time means that the mixture hangs around long enough to do its job before the solvent evaporates off. To establish the appearance of a fully saturated control, we erased a line of pigment from an area of the spotted grouse. Next to it, we tested our solvents for penetration and evaporation. Water still sat on the surface, but ethanol penetrated and evaporated more rapidly, and isopropanol faster still. So we thought, what if we mixed ethanol and isopropanol together to take advantage of the characteristics of both? Plus, when you add 2 or more solvents together, you can achieve actually more than merely the sum of their parts. We tested new consolidant mixtures right next to the erased line and kept track of how many coats were required to achieve the same level of saturation. In some cases, we also tried laying down the consolidant on top of a layer of ethanol, which helped carry it into the paint film. We discovered that methylcellulose solutions mixed 1-to-1-to-1 with ethanol and isopropanol performed better than anything we had yet tried. Better still, they did not revert after a week or 2. We could resign ourselves to applying multiple coats if, in fact, the haze was not going to come back.
To my surprise, I also discovered that ethanol alone helped to resaturate the paint layers in a previously consolidated plate, the barn owl, and that this effect did not reverse itself with time. And this may be because ethanol naturally absorbs moisture from the atmosphere, so that the ethanol was actually pulling more water in and resaturating my consolidant, making it work better. Further testing confirmed that multiple coats of the 1-to-1-to-1 isopropanol, ethanol, and methylcellulose solution would still be required to fully saturate it. An ethanol precoat before each consolidant layer helped tremendously with penetration and saturation. But this left me with an alarming series of squares in the sky from all my testing. To my infinite relief, swabbing with ethanol and vigorous applications of the new 1:1:1 consolidant solution cleared up the barn owl beautifully, and I could call the treatment a success at last. Huzzah! Armed with the knowledge we had gleaned from all this testing, Anne and I embarked on treatment for the rest of the plates. I ended up treating the entirety of Volume 1 before exhibition, while Anne worked on Volume 2. I consolidated 37 plates, mended tears in 42, and trimmed or reattached lifting linen linings on 18. On birds like the great horned owl, consolidation meant painting over each of the dark brown feathers individually, while avoiding all of the yellow, orange, and tan areas to avoid dissolving gamboge. It was incredibly satisfying to see the purple haze disappear and the printed details of the feathers emerge through the haze. And you can see on the right side of the central image, that area has been consolidated and is much darker. On the right image, I've just started on the back bird, and you can just see that one really dark feather at its throat. They should all look like that. This one was really fun. It was very subtle at the beginning, and then as I worked, you could sort of see the extent of the haze. So before treatment, you wouldn't necessarily think anything was wrong with that plate. But when I started applying the consolidant, you can see the darker lines at the edges of the wings. I've just begun consolidating there. And on the right, both wings have been consolidated, but not the back, which gives you an idea of what the haze looked like. Other plates, like the mythical Bird of Washington, did not go as smoothly. In this case, both the paint and the ink appeared to be hazy. You can see the hazy lines on top of the printing ink in the middle picture. The entire bird was so dark, opaque, and cloudy that the repeated coats of consolidant began to make it look shiny and blotchy, and it took a lot of finessing to sort of blend them all and make it look good again, something that Anne will talk more about in a second. I essentially worked from the back of the book to the front, so when I finally got to plate 1, the one that made people want to subscribe, it was time to celebrate, even though this was another really challenging treatment with thick paint and problematic shiny areas.
Since Sketching Splendor opened in April, I've continued treatment on Volume 2 and have worked on 28 plates, mostly consolidation. Our summer intern, book conservator Brittany Murray here, treated the mangrove hummingbird because it reminded her of her Florida home. As I continued work, I found our trusted solution gave mixed results, varying even within one plate. The challenge with Volume 2 seems to be achieving a deep velvety black without creating that shiny surface. I was also finding layers of transparent glaze that I didn't want to disturb. When in doubt, we try to err on the side of doing less consolidation than more. Besides being a visually striking image, the Labrador falcon gives us a great example of the value of varied lighting during the examination of a plate, as well as during treatment. When viewed obliquely, like in the middle image here, you can really see the hazy areas sitting distinctly on the top surface of the image. And we're all in love with this image of the ferruginous thrush. And I think we'll just continue on. I have a lengthy Audubon quote. We'll just skip over that, even though it's very poetic.
He talks about exciting the viewer's compassion for the birds.
Yes.
And I will say in closing that this whole project really excited our compassion, both for the plates, but mainly for each other, because it was so challenging. And so we had a great opportunity to consult our colleagues together and to moan together when things didn't go well and to celebrate together when things did go right. And I'm really going to miss that interaction as I move on in the lab without you, Anne. So thank you very much for everything that you have offered me during the last 9 years of me being here.
And thank you for what you've offered me.
And we're also very grateful to all these people who helped us with our research and testing and treatment. And thank you for listening. We're excited to take your questions.
Any ideas why it would happen to some sets and not others?
I mean, my best guess is that it's something about our environment and or the treatment that our book received with the linings and things like that. At first, we did think it was more associated with the plates that hadn't been lined, but it was definitely present on other plates as well. That's still a really good question that we don't have a good answer for.
Yeah, it's very frustrating because also in volume 2, I was experiencing more reaction from the printing ink itself and not the paint layer. So it's the ink, and that's been incredibly difficult to stick those paint particles back on. Yeah, it's just, we're still kind of scratching our heads about that. Yeah.
Because ink usually, for that kind of ink to have that kind of reaction, it often requires some kind of alkaline material to be present. So I don't know if, if the linings, if they actually were washing the plates as well and used an alkaline solution, that could have something to do with it. We don't know enough about what has happened to the plates in the past, essentially, or about their storage conditions. But, that would play into it.
Something happened especially when the 4 volumes that didn't get the same amount of exposure as volume 1, they just sort of created their own system of degradation because they were not being opened routinely like volume 1, or as routinely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is highly related. Would it be something similar for why the Drexel versions seem to have a different, or none of this, or did any of the plates have any of the
We
things
saw
you saw?
a tiny bit on a few plates, but it was like, at this point, we'd been looking at our plates for so long that we had eagle eyes, so to speak, for the haze. And so we'd go, oh, it's starting there. But we still don't know enough about, why are their circumstances so different from ours? Their bindings had all the plates lined. So if it was, either they were lined with a different process, but they weren't all hazy like ours.
And, well, the other difference is the volumes there were routinely exhibited. So they did have that exposure to air and were
Light,
not
yeah.
crushed in and self-destroying, essentially.
Yeah.
So we think there's something going on there.
Right.
They were in beautiful condition. We love them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more.
I'd like to ask you a little broader question, and that is how you prioritize conservation work here at APS. Are you going to go on and do volumes 3, 4, and 5, or which I assume were started because of the current show that's up, or generally, I'm sure there's lots of stuff that could take conservation here at APS. How do you prioritize that work?
It's both from exhibition and from researcher use in the library. In this case, initially, probably through some magical thinking on all our part about the size of our gallery, we thought we could exhibit all 5 volumes.
We wanted to
We
exhibit
wanted to. We
all
really
5
wanted to.
volumes.
But that turned out to be physically impossible, luckily for us, or else we'd be dead of overwork.
No, we'd just be using those
Like Alexander
gallons
Wilson,
of
gallons of
yeah,
consolidation.
yeah.
But yeah, so that is what made this treatment a priority. Yes, our intention is to treat all 5 volumes because it's rare for them to be digitized in their entirety and in individual libraries online for people to access, and we do hope to do that with our books. So volume 2 is ongoing, and 3, 4, and 5 will come in future years. We'll just keep picking away at the problem.
All right. I wish we had time for more questions. I do. But could you join me in giving a round of applause quickly to our speakers? So applause is one thing, but we wanted to make a more material tribute to acknowledge Anne's contributions to the APS. As a result, it is my very great pleasure to announce that the APS will be book plating the 2nd volume of Audubon's Birds of America in Anne's honor.
Oh. Well, I better come finish it.
That was a surprise. So that in a way, in addition to the myriad other documents that Anne has helped to conserve over her career. She will always be with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, everyone.
Your bookplate makes a lot more sense than Ord's.
And thank all of you for attending this afternoon's session. I hope you found it as engaging and as enlightening as I did. No pun intended, since we were lightening things up. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.